So we're going to begin this facial rigging tutorial by talking about the principles of animation. This is important because these are the foundation rules or guiding principles for the style of deformations that we're going to be building in our characters, especially a character that's going to be used in feature animation. The whole point of these tutorials, this whole series, is to apply these 2D animation principles, which have been tried and true over the decades, and apply them in a digital environment. Once again, the genesis of the principles of animation came about with the early Disney animators and is codified in the book by Frank and Ollie called The Illusion of Life. This book is a must-have for anyone interested in animation. So we're not going to cover all of the principles of animation, just a couple of them as they apply to facial rigging and deformations. So one of the first principles is squash and stretch, and many of us who study animation have seen this exemplified in the simple bouncing ball. Here we start with the spherical ball at the apogee or high point of the bounce, and here as it drops it will accelerate, and that acceleration is shown by the stretching or expansion of that volume. And always the volume will be preserved, so as it expands along one axis, it will compress in the other. So here's our stretching to show that this ball is accelerating as it drops. And then when it impacts, we'll squash it to show that there is a compression of energy as it impacts the ground. And then it springs back, releasing that energy, which is once again shown through another stretching motion. And then once again at the top of the arc, it returns to its original position. And here's the same ball as applied to the belly of this character. Here we can see the stretch, the impact with the squash, and then the acceleration or spring out of this impact with another stretch. So here's the bouncing ball applied to a character, so that makes a little more sense. Then here's another simple example. If we think of this as a basically two ball masses, the skull and then the jaw area, we can see how this squash and stretch is applied on a simple double take of this character or startled expression. Now, if we were to go from the default pose to the expanded or startled pose, it's a pretty good move there. Pretty good, one pose to the other. But if we add in this squash, it sets up some place to go, an anticipation. And typically you'll see animators, rather than going from the default to the final extended pose, they'll transition through a pose of anticipation, which will be the opposite of the final pose. And once again, this can be seen simply as squash and stretch. Here's another example of that, very similar example. And here once again we have the start pose and the end pose. Very similar, very similar. But if an animator were to go from this to this pose, it wouldn't be that dynamic. So once again, we apply the principles of squash to give us a sense of anticipation, basically compressing the energy. And we know that once it goes from the default into this compressed state, it's going to have to spring out, which gives us this dynamic stretched pose. Then it settles back into the final pose. But rather than going from the beginning to the end pose, by adding in this anticipation and then the release of energy, to squash and stretch, you get a much more dynamic animation motion. And once again, a very basic principle, first shown with the simple bouncing ball. So here we have another of the principles, which is follow through or overlapping action. And here we have the example of a bow tie, where if you were holding the top knot of this tie, and you were to drag it from one side to the other and then stop, the overlap or drag would cause the bottom of the tie to lag behind and stretch behind the leading edge or knot of this tie. And then in the second half of the motion, once you stop dragging this tie, you'll have an overlap where the bottom of the tie will drag behind and then overlap and flop forward and then eventually settle down to its default position here. This is also shown in this large character where we have the main force of energy with the hip going down and up. We also have this counter action or overlapping action of this fatty mass where when the main mass is pulling in one direction, the outer masses lag or overlap, and it takes a little while for them to catch up. But while they're catching up, the main mass will be moving in the opposite direction once again. And you can see this with something as simple as a water balloon. If you were to hold it somewhat in the middle and then shake it up and down, the main force of the action will be in the center of the water balloon, but then the two outer edges will lag behind and give this overlapping or counter action. When applied to a face, we get this type of motion here. And once again, if we start with the start pose and the end pose, a simple turn of the head from one side to the other, it's not that dynamic a motion. As a matter of fact, it's almost a mirror image of the start pose. But when you add in the overlapping action, as well as the squash and stretch, you get a much more dynamic action here. So here we can see, going from this first pose, we go into a squash pose, which is the anticipation for this turn. And then with the quick head turn, we get stretch as well as drag and overlapping action. And then it settles into this final pose. Once again, another simple example is our arm here, going from one pose to the settle, the final pose. Pretty decent pose here, but once again, by adding in these intermediary poses, which is the anticipation and then the overshoot, it gives a much more dynamic motion and adds a lot more energy between these two poses. And these are all very simple principles that we'll keep in mind when designing and creating the controls and deformations for a character's face. These are the type of deformations and controls that an animator will want to have when animating a character for feature animation. So the next step is we want to get as much reference as we can. The reference can come in the form of 2D drawings provided by you, the animator or the art director. 3D models, other 3D characters can be used as reference, and then there's always real life reference. Real people with facial structures similar to those of your characters, or animals with facial structures, or people who exemplify the type of expressions. Perhaps you're designing a character that has very fatty jowls. Then you can look for that type of character in either of these three types of reference. One of the importance of reference is that it serves as a roadmap for the rigging that you'll create. Rather than sitting down with the model and then building the rig and deformations as you see fit, by getting reference from the animators and art directors and you yourself investigating different possibilities for how this face can move and deform and how that will service the character, it gives you a place to go. Rather than guessing, you'll have a very clear path or process that you'll apply to creating your deformations. Next, you'll know what you need before you start. Rather than in the previous example, just sitting down, starting your rigging, and then you present your final rig to an animator, and they need more controls that you've put in there, or they want them to behave a little differently. If you start out with reference and communication with both your animator and art director, then you'll arrive at a suitable rig rather than starting and ending up with something that isn't as useful as if you had spoken with them and gotten this reference in the first place. So once again, it helps you to define what you're going to be doing before you start doing it. And lastly, all rigging is to service the animation and the art direction. So the reference will just help you in that regard. So here we have some drawings of the caveman character. And these are drawings produced by Dave Coleman. And they show just what he saw as some of the range of expression for this character. Now here we have some fairly realistic. I mean, this is pretty broad, but a very animalistic expression. Here we have something a little goofy, a little puzzled here. A few very animalistic expressions. Then here we have some more quizzical expressions up here, and then some more animalistic expressions. Once again, this is just a representation of the type of reference that you might get when diving into your character. And this helps tremendously. As we go through rigging this character, we'll have targets that we can evaluate our final rig against. And sometimes you may not be able to get exactly what the 2D reference will present to you. There are a lot of things that a 2D artist can do to, sort of cheat poses, but someone, as this artist here, Dave Coleman, will have knowledge of the 3D realm in mind, and so they won't overextend their drawings. I mean, they'll put as much expressiveness as they need into them, but they'll also keep in mind the constraints and the difficulties of the medium that the final rig or final character will be produced in. But once again, these drawings, although they may in some cases be a little more extreme than what the topology or the final product ends up being, it gives us a point of comparison and helps guides us as we build our rigging. And aside from the character sketches, having real human anatomy as a reference is a very good thing to have as well. Basically, you can think of animated characters that if they're emoting in a human fashion, if you have a dog that talks or a chicken that smiles, you're basically taking a human muscle structure and applying it to that character or creature or object in that sense. So understanding the human facial anatomy is also as important as having the more fanciful character anatomy. So once again, I like to draw or thank Dave Coleman, who originally designed the caveman character and also provided the sketches for the facial poses. And then once again, Joe Sandstrom, who produced the drawings illustrating the principles of animation as well. So in conclusion, I'd like to end with a few thoughts. First of all, facial rigging, like any rigging that we produce, its primary goal is that it's driven by what the needs of the animation and art direction are. We're basically enabling the animators to do their job as well as helping to realize the vision of the art directors and directors. And always, the more reference you can get and the earlier you can get it, the better. Not only getting reference, but also communicating with both the animators and art directors, modelers, anyone in the production process that impacts your work and whose work you will impact. It's always best to keep those lines of communication as open as possible. Then the last thought is basically in building facial deformation, you'll see two dominant approaches. One of them is direct deformations. That's using joints or wire deformers, clusters, that type of thing to directly manipulate the topology or the model itself. That in that sense, you'll be actually grabbing controls right on the character's face, and the animator will manipulate them directly. Another of the two dominant deformation approaches is using blend shapes. And what that is that's using a secondary target and then blending in a linear fashion so that you can model a pose of a smile, for instance, and then transition from the default, basically closed mouth character, to a smile pose that you've modeled or a grimace pose that you've modeled. And one thing to also remember is that although you'll often see these two approaches used separately and distinct from one another, it is possible to combine them to meet the needs of your pipeline and character. Um, there are ways of doing it more robustly using plugins, but there are ways of mimicking the blending of direct deformations and blend shapes using simple tricks with Maya out of the box. And we'll go over both of these methods and then simple ways of combining them throughout these tutorials.